I want to talk about two artists whose names we know and whom we can attribute works of art to them. The first one is Rainier of Hue, and he is the sculptor who created the baptismal font that is today in Saint Bartholomew in Liège, but came from the church of Notre Dame des Fonts in Liège, Notre Dame of the Font, as you can see. And this was created in 1118. And there you see it. You see the basin of the font with sculpture, which we'll take a closer look at. And then at the base, we have these oxen, and it seems as though they are supporting the basin. And we'll explain what they are doing there in just a moment. The height is just under 24 inches, the diameter a little bit over 31 inches. And we talk about Mousson work from the Maas River Valley, which is today in Belgium and a bit of the part of Germany that's adjacent to Belgium. Liège was a center for classical learning. And the style of this, as we'll see, is very remarkable for the Romanesque period. I told you I'd tell you what the oxen were doing there. This is a recreation of the molten sea standing on 12 oxen that was in the Temple of Solomon. And as you can see, you can read about it in 1 Kings. Now, of course, we don't have any pictures of that. We don't know exactly what it was, but they have conceived of the molten sea as being water, a font, that stands on 12 oxen, sculptural. This particular verse and the object in Solomon's temple is sometimes considered to be an Old Testament type for the baptism of Christ. In other words, something that prefigures the baptism of Christ. And so we have the 12 oxen, who Christians would interpret as the symbols of 12 apostles. And this kind of symbolism is found in the writings of a contemporary theologian, Rupert of Dutz, in his treatise on the Trinity from 1117. Now, as we look at the font and we go around it, there are different scenes. As you see here, we're taking a look at the baptism of Christ, but there are other scenes. There's St. John the Baptist is baptizing Christ, and then you see St. John the Baptist preaching, and then him baptizing other people. And then we see some of the other apostles baptizing. We see St. Peter baptizing Cornelius, the Roman centurion who converted to Christianity, and St. John the Evangelist baptizing the Greek philosopher Crato. And these, of course, are from Acts of the Apostles. So here we're looking at the baptism of Christ. And as you can see, you have Christ in the center with what looks kind of like a funnel with wavy lines, and that's supposed to be the Jordan River. And then up above him, we see God the Father leaning over. So we're really just looking at the top of the head because it's actually projecting out. And the dove of the Holy Spirit is descending on Christ. And on one side, of course, we have John the Baptist, who is baptizing. On the other side, we have several angels who are holding Christ's garment. You can see they have it outstretched. They're serving, I guess you could say they're serving as servants to Christ. Now, of course, in the story of the baptism of Christ, there is a voice from heaven heard. And it says, the Spirit of God descends like a dove. So we have that metaphor of the Spirit of God, or the Holy Spirit, being represented as a dove. And the words are heard from on high. This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Well, that's the iconography. That's the story as is told in the Bible. Those angels, incidentally, who are ministering to Christ, are not in the Bible, but they do appear very frequently in art. But what's so remarkable about this particular sculpture, this high relief sculpture, as you can see, is the style. Now, we've looked at works of art from Vézelay, from Autun, and we've talked about the very active and abstract style of Romanesque artists. And remember, when we say Romanesque, we don't mean Roman. It's a name given to 11th and early 12th century art. In some places it lasts longer throughout the 12th century, but a particular artistic style. And because the buildings had rounded arches and tunnel vaults and occasionally even domes, it was considered to be like the Romans, but it is not Roman or classical art. And you can certainly see that when you look at works of art such as those at Autun or Vézelay. The sculpture is, as I said, very abstract, very non-classical. But here we're seeing an artist who's using a style that is very classicizing. Could he have seen Roman statues in Liège or early Christian sarcophagi that were more classical in style? Possibly. Remember, the Romans got, clear up into England, so they certainly were in the area that we today call Belgium. And a lot of work that perhaps was known in earlier eras has perished, doesn't exist anymore today. But when we look at these figures, they are graceful, somewhat idealized, well-proportioned figures. And I said they seem very serene. And then we look at the draperies which wrap the body and reveal the body beneath the draperies. And that's what's so classicizing. That, we can look at St. John there and see the drapery pulled over and see where his leg is and where his knee is. We have the sense of a physical body beneath them. Even the angels, who are by definition spiritual beings, seem to have, a body beneath the draperies. And if you look over here on the left side, you'll notice we're seeing just some of the backs of some of these very high relief figures in the next scene. And you can see that there's a drapery that wraps around this figure. We see the shoulder is uncovered, but the rest of the body is pretty much swathed in drapery. And yet we have a sense of where the hip is, where the knee is, where the leg is, because it reminds us of a classical figure. Wrapped in, I was going to say a toga, that's not exactly a toga, but, wrapped in some kind of fabric and revealing the body beneath it. So as I said, this is just remarkable for this period. Here we're seeing St. John the Evangelist baptizing the philosopher Crato. So we even have a sort of half-nude figure from the back. And you can see the hand of God is coming down and rays of light are shining down. And you may be able to make out that, how do we know this is what it is? Well, it says there, right there. It has the name of, in Latin, of John the Evangelist. And you can see in the scene beside it, there's the hand of God reaching down. Now, something else I wanted you to notice were the little trees, these little stylized trees, which are quite fanciful. They may remind you of trees in the bronze doors at Hildesheim, or even in Carolingian manuscripts. So, these kind of little undulating trees with the sort of this big top on it are something that we've seen in art before. And what they're doing here is dividing each section, and they're also indicating that sometimes that this is out of doors. So, even though when we think of Romanesque sculpture, we think very abstract sculpture like Giselbert's style, this proves to us that the classical influence continues, even in Northern Europe. And how would he have come up with this? Well, presumably there were classical monuments that still existed in the 12th century. And so what we're seeing is what this artist did with it. In a sense, he's reinterpreting classical style, and it's been, you could say, it's been filtered through the traditions of Carolingian and Ottonian art. And think of things like the doors at Hildesheim, in which people had little tubular arms. And we can still see the remnants of that. But this artist has the arms bending in the proper places. They may seem a little thin, but, they work. Here we see John the Baptist preaching. Once again, he's pulled that drapery so it's really tight over his body. And you can see various people, including some soldiers, evidently, with the men in, is that chainmail? In armor there. Now, all of these, as we said, are very high relief in bronze. So it's been cast. And they have a background. Of course, it's a curving background of the edge of the basin of the font. But there is almost a feeling of space, just because the figures are set against an empty background. Think about the Vienna Genesis, one of the earliest surviving Bible images in manuscript form that still exists, the 6th century. And, they used the page essentially as space. And then the figures could turn and be in different positions. And it's very similar to the way, a manuscript page might be set up. So the figures project out. And there is a landscape that's suggested just by using a few of these trees. And then you'll remember those curving lines that represent the ripples in the water at the Jordan River. So the continuation, or the resurfacing even, of classical style, even in the 12th century. Now, the next artist I want to talk to you about is a goldsmith. So he's doing, once again, casting metal sculpture, as we'll see, for a particular function. We're going to look at a reliquary. And he also is known as an enamelist, an artist who creates images using the colored enamels. Now, this is Nicholas of Verdun. And Nicholas is a pivotal figure in the transition between the late Romanesque and the early Gothic. What do we call him? He usually gets stuck in with the Romanesque, but you'll see that some of the things that he does anticipate developments in French Gothic art. His work in enamels will illustrate a new naturalism in modeling and a break from the linear abstraction of most Romanesque art. And once again, think of Giselbertus or the master at Vézelay. All those wonderful curving lines that were, grooves that were carved into the stone. Well, here you're going to see some modeling that suggests greater naturalism. Now, what he uses is what we call nilio for the lines of the draperies, and you'll see them bunch and wrap the figures. We'll take a look at this. I'll show you. Okay, here is the work of art. It's called the Kloster Neuburg altarpiece. It was completed in 1181. It's made out of gold and enamel, and it's 28 inches high. However, this was not the original form of these enamels. They were originally part of a pulpit, and they were taken and arranged as a kind of altarpiece. And here we're looking at the center of it. Now, why is it called the Kloster Neuburg altarpiece? Because it's now in the town of Kloster Neuburg, which is near Vienna. So this is not what it originally looked like. The individual images are, but it would have been a pulpit. And there was a fire in the 14th century, 1330. And so they took the plaques. Maybe some of them were damaged. Maybe the wooden framework of the pulpit was burned. But they took the surviving plaques and they reused them to create this triptych, or the altarpiece, in 3 parts, 3 sections. Now, we have 3 rows of biblical scenes. The top row, and here you can see the picture I have only shows 2 rows, but there is a 3rd row. The top row shows scenes from the era under grace. In other words, the life of Christ, after things that have happened after Christ was born. The next one down is the era under the law. It's the Moses story. And then we have the other layer, which seems to be mostly images before the law. Genesis, Noah, the stories of the figures in the Old Testament that came before Moses wrote the laws. And as you may know, not just the 10 Commandments, but also the laws in the Pentateuch, particularly in Leviticus and Numbers, are often attributed to Moses and called the laws of Moses. Okay, so let's look a little closer at this and see the technique that's being used. As I say, the materials are enamel and gold. And there's a number of techniques that we use with enamel. This is called champ levé. Champ levé. And this is the enamel technique in which the metal, in this case gold, is hollowed out, or is depressed, to receive colored enamels. So you can put the powder of the enamels, or could be, even ground glass that is colored, and of course this would be melted so that it would form this beautiful, smooth, glassy surface in the different colors that were used in it. Neelio, we mentioned Neelio before. Neelio makes what look like lines. The craftsman has incised grooves in the metal, and then they have been filled with either black or, in this case, with colored metallic alloy. And, as we're looking at them, we see them as lines. And here you see a scene of the Pentecost, or the apostles receiving the Holy Spirit. And you can see these lines made from Neelio look like they're wrapping the bodies of the apostles. It's giving a sort of a 3-dimensional effect. Now, as we said, Nicholas of Verdun's style is a transitional style between Romanesque and the new naturalism of the Gothic. There seems to be classical influence. We see the drapery folds as lines, wrap the body, cling to the body. And here we're seeing, the descent of the Holy Spirit, the apostles receiving the Holy Spirit. Some angels are blowing the last trumpet. And as you can see directly below there's the resurrection of the dead. So there's little Last Judgment imagery in some of these adjacent images, some of which are cut off. You can't see them. And then we see Moses receiving the law, which we just saw a moment ago. And here you see the two we talked about with the angels blowing the last trumpet and the resurrection of the dead. These are the coffins that are being opened. The sarcophagi are coming off, and so they're lifting up the lids of all the sarcophagi, and people now have taken on human flesh again. They've been reborn and are coming for the last judgment. This is the ascension of Christ. And there's a number of things that are really interesting in it. I'm sure that some of you immediately noticed that what you have are these little wavy lines at the top that represent clouds, and there are these feet dangling down. Well, we see this a lot in German art, and it goes on for centuries. It's one way of showing the ascension into heaven, especially when you have a small space. So we're just seeing Jesus' feet dangling down as he's rising up to heaven, and he's going through the clouds, and only the feet are visible. You're not seeing this here, but there was a story, a traveler's tales perhaps, that there was a rock on which the pilgrims believed that they could see the footprints of Jesus from before he ascended into heaven. So we think maybe that's connected here because it's really emphasizing the feet, as you can see. Another explanation for just showing it like this, in some churches on Ascension Day, they would have a statue of Christ, which they would wince up. They just have probably pulleys and pull the statue up as though it were rising into heaven. And probably when people looked up, they'd see the little feet dangling down. But, whatever the explanation, we do see this. Now, the other thing you'll notice, because we have all of these figures here, is how the colored nilio forms these very graceful, curving lines that suggest draperies that wrap the body. You can see Mary and the draperies pulled tight around her, and some of the other apostles. And then there's one apostle who is right there in front, and his head is tipped back. The artist wants to show you the foreshortening. He does it a bit too much. We would say, gee, wait, you can't bend your head back. It looks quite that far, maybe. It looks a little odd, almost like the head is just perched on the shoulders. But this is, as we said, transitional. He's showing, I would say, greater naturalism just by trying to show a foreshortened head, even if he hasn't got it, 100% correct yet. And there you see another reproduction of the same image. Now, this is the example that's in your textbook. They show you a detail of one of these sections of the enamel work. And your text calls it a flight into Egypt. But that's an error. And I think you can see it when you just, before you say a person on a donkey and you think flight into Egypt. Okay, that's pretty normal. But let's look at it a little closer. Wait a minute. In a flight into Egypt, Mary is riding on the donkey, holding the Christ child, and Joseph is usually walking along, maybe leading the donkey. Here we have something very different. You have a man on the donkey with a child, and then you have a woman walking beside holding a child. Well, Mary and Joseph only had one child, Jesus, according to Christian belief. There are some people in the Bible who are mentioned as the brothers of Christ, but according to St. Jerome, who believed very fervently in the perpetual virginity of Mary, the term brothers was really referring to cousins of Christ. So, whatever you believe about that, the doctrinal idea that was absolutely accepted was that Mary had only her miraculous child, Jesus. So, so who are these people? Well, it's pretty easy in a sense because, as you would say, looking right below, you see Moses written out at the bottom very clearly. Moses and Egypt. So, is this Moses returning to Egypt with his family? Remember that Moses killed a overseer who was beating one of the Hebrew slaves, and he felt like he had to leave, and he goes off and rescues the daughters of Jethro and eventually marries one of them and has children, and then is sent back to Egypt to rescue the Hebrews from slavery under Pharaoh. So we have the figure, which probably is Moses, because that's what it says, and Moses' wife, and he seems to have 2 children here. You might notice that he's wearing on his head a hat that looks really like a funnel. It's this projecting piece off the head. That actually is a Jew cap. It's what in medieval art you see people who are identified as Jews wearing. And of course, Moses would be one of the most prominent of people of the Jewish faith. And of course, once again, you can also see the suggestion that, yes, we are outside with our donkey because we have this curving, stylized tree filling up space, making beautiful shapes against the blue enamel background. So we use this blue enamel background. The Nelio is usually in blue or red. And then, of course, the gold. Gold is one of those things that it doesn't, it can be melted, but it doesn't tarnish. And so these are, we're seeing them with the bright colors that you would have seen when they were first created. And of course, different photographs are taken in different lights, so sometimes they'll be darker, as you see here, in some than the others. I could only find this with the Annunciation here, and you see the baptism of Christ. And you'll note that just like Rainier of Hugh, the Jordan River seems to be flowing upward. There was a legend that when Jesus stepped into the Jordan River stopped flowing. And it may just be a way of trying to show, a river. It may refer to that legend. I can't be sure. And here we have some other scenes, but I didn't have a colored picture of them. The crossing of the Red Sea, the circumcision of Christ. And, of course, they would be blue and gold, but the photograph was done in black and white. This I thought you might find interesting. Here is Jonah. And you'll remember we talked about the early Christian catacombs with pictures of Jonah. And, of course, there were early Christian sarcophagi. So this is, a very old image in Christian art, the idea of Joseph. And here you can see with our catacomb image of Joseph being thrown overboard for Leviathan to swallow. And he's 3 days in the belly of Leviathan and then is vomited forth on land. There's some similarities and differences to how this is shown here in the 12th century. You can see that Jonah, they're actually sort of feeding him into the mouth of Leviathan, not just throwing him overboard and then the sea monster comes and gets him. So the sailors are literally feeding him into the mouth of Leviathan, and we see his feet sort of up in the air. There's the design of the ship has changed a little bit too. Now, you may be thinking, well, gee, those are all flat images. Why do you have him under sculpture? Well, as I said, he's a goldsmith. They wouldn't have said sculptor, and put everybody with bronze like Rainier de Hugh. I should have mentioned that. Liège was a center for metalworking. Okay, but here we are with Nicholas of Verdun. So he's a goldsmith. And when he's working with three-dimensional images, these very high-relief images that will be seen in a moment, then we could call him a sculptor in our language, in our way of phrasing things. Nicholas of Verdun and his workshop created one of the most famous reliquaries, the Shrine of the Three Kings at Cologne Cathedral, or Kölner Dome. This is a very famous reliquary. It dates, as you can see, from the very end of the 12th century into the 13th century, about 1190 to 1230. Probably took a long time to work on that. And the relics that are shown, the relics that are encased therein, were believed to be relics of the three magi, or wise men, who were believed to be kings from the east. And so there's a whole story about the wise men, which is told in Johannes of Hildesheim's book on the three kings. So, be very well known in Germany because it's a German author. And Cologne is one of those cities that has so many patron saints. It has what are believed to be the relics of the Magi, who there's a whole story about them, how they went off, they became Christian, and they preached, and eventually they were martyred. And Cologne believes they have their bones, I believe. And here we're seeing the shrine, and it's shaped somewhat like a church, like a basilica church, with the high central nave, and then where the clerestory would be, you have little niches with figures, and then you have the lower section of the church that shows the side aisles coming out, and once again, all around it we have arches with figures within. And of course it's made with precious materials, precious materials to be worthy of the saints. Now, technique that's used here is called repoussoir. And repoussoir is when you have a design that has been raised into relief. And depending on what kind of metal you're using, you may just be able to press from the back, or you might have to hammer it out. But it's going from the reverse and pushing these out. So the figure appears to be solid. It's in very high relief. And once again, you see the drapery folds here actually three-dimensional rather than just with the Nelio lines, but the draperies cling to the body. They wrap the body. See where the elbow is, where the legs are. And the figure has a turn in space. This is the prophet Joel, and he's looking out at us frontally. The upper part of his torso and his head are facing outward, looking to the front. And the bottom half of his body is turned. And there's a flexing of the knees. And you have, really you see how the body can twist in space and how the legs can be at different angles. And you might also want to notice here that he has done colored enamels. This is as I said, richly decorated shrine. Here you see a black and white image of the prophet from the side. How very high relief he is, and how profuse are the draperies that just wrap his body. All of these myriad of folds. And just showing you another figure here, a bishop, a figure with a scroll. Just more details.